By February 1943, Stalingrad was like a graveyard. Over 90,000 German soldiers had surrendered to the Red Army, ending one of the deadliest battles in history. But for these men, surrender didn't mean safety. It represented a slow descent into a nightmare that most wouldn't survive. What happened to these men after Stalingrad? Their fate is one of the most brutal and overlooked stories of World War II. Welcome back to Before Now, where we explore the untold stories of history's most important events. In today's episode, we're exploring the brutal reality German soldiers faced after being captured at Stalingrad. These men, once part of Hitler's formidable Sixth Army, endured conditions that were inhumane, unrelenting, and designed to break both body and spirit. From the moment they were taken prisoner, their lives were marked by brutal hardship, psychological trauma, and a struggle for survival that would last years. If you're fascinated by history and want to learn more about the untold stories of World War II, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and leave us a comment on what you think about the fate of these soldiers. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Picture this: you've survived months of unrelenting battle and freezing temperatures, only to lay down your arms. You're hungry, freezing, and sick, but at least the fighting is over. For the Sixth Army survivors, this surrender wasn't salvation. It was the beginning of an ordeal most didn't survive. The Soviet Union, destroyed by the German invasions and having endured years of unimaginable suffering at the hands of the German invaders, saw no reason to offer kindness or compassion to their captives. To them, these men were the enemies who made them suffer. And now the tables had turned. It was their turn to suffer. But what came next wasn't just harsh, it was catastrophic. The first shock that the Germans faced, the lack of preparation by the Soviets. With over 90,000 men surrendering, Soviet forces had no infrastructure to handle these prisoners. There were no proper shelters, no organized food supplies, and no medical care. Instead, the prisoners were herded like cattle into makeshift holding areas. Many collapsed from exhaustion, malnutrition, or untreated wounds. For many, death came quickly and, thankfully, within days of capture. Those who survived quickly realized they were living on borrowed time. After the initial chaos of capture, these prisoners faced a new horror: the death marches. With no transportation available, the Soviets forced tens of thousands of starving, frostbitten men to march hundreds of miles through one of the coldest winters in history without proper clothing or shoes. Food was a luxury. Most prisoners got nothing more than scraps of bread or whatever they could scavenge along the way. Prisoners shared stories of eating grass, tree bark, or even the leather from their own boots in desperation. Those that couldn't keep up were left behind. Falling meant dying, whether from exposure to the harsh cold or a Soviet bullet. Men froze to death where they stood. Others succumbed to dysentery or exhaustion. The Soviets didn't stop for the dying, they just moved on. And for the survivors, the destination waiting at the end of the march was even worse. For those who survived the march, life in the labor camps was a slow death. These camps, scattered across Siberia, were some of the most inhospitable places on Earth, designed to squeeze every last bit of labor out of their prisoners before they perished. Temperatures often dropped below 30 degrees Celsius, and the prisoners were forced to work long hours on minimal rations. The work was brutal and endless, cutting timber, digging canals, building roads. The conditions were inhumane. With no protective clothing, no gloves, and no rest, frostbite and disease were almost inevitable. Many prisoners lost fingers, toes, and even entire limbs to the cold. Some were so weak they couldn't even hold their tools. Daily rations were barely enough to sustain life. A small piece of bread and watery soup was all they had to fuel their grueling labor. Starvation was constant, and death was everywhere. Men died in their sleep, at their workstations, or simply collapsed and were never seen again. The camps weren't designed for survival. They were designed to extract every ounce of labor from these men before they inevitably perished to hunger or the biting cold. But the suffering wasn't just physical. Imagine the psychological toll of losing everything: your comrades, your homeland, your dignity. For many of these men, they were under unbearable mental strain. These men had marched into the Soviet Union as part of Hitler's grand vision, believing in their own superiority. Now they were starving, humiliated, and treated as less than human. It broke them, not just physically but emotionally. Some prisoners described feeling like ghosts, alive but barely human. The shame of defeat, the guilt over their actions in the war, and the helplessness of their situation crushed their spirits. How do you hold on to hope when you're surrounded by death, when every day is a battle just to stay alive? Some found solace in religion or memories of home. Others simply gave up, choosing death over another day of suffering. Many of these survivors were never the same after their captivity. With every death, the survivors were reminded of their own fragile existence. Each day was a battle, not just for food or warmth, but for the will to keep going. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, don't forget to subscribe to Before Now, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about the fate of these soldiers? We'd love to hear your perspective. Of the 90,000 German soldiers taken prisoner, only around 5,000 ever made it back to Germany after the war. That's less than 6%. For comparison, American and British POWs in German camps faced mortality rates of less than 5%. These men didn't die on the battlefield, they died in shameful captivity. The reasons for these deaths were clear: starvation, disease, exhaustion, and outright neglect. For the Soviets, this was vengeance for the millions of their own people killed by the German invasion. But for the prisoners, it was a slow, agonizing demise. For those who did survive and were eventually released, the journey home was just as difficult and bittersweet. After spending years in captivity, many returned to a Germany that they barely recognized, to a home that was devastated by war. The men who returned were not the same. They were broken, physically and emotionally scarred by the years of abuse they had suffered and endured. The legacy of Stalingrad and the fate of the POWs left a deep mark on post-war German society. Many soldiers struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, and the trauma they experienced in Soviet captivity was often ignored or misunderstood by their fellow Germans. These men carried the weight of their experiences for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of their time in captivity, while others chose silence, unable to relive the horrors. For their families, it was like welcoming home a stranger, a man who had survived but who would never truly heal or be the same again. Stories like this remind us of the true cost of war, not just in battles fought, but in the lives forever changed. If you found this video interesting, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories from the past to your screens. Today, Stalingrad stands as a monument to the tragedy of war. The Battle of Stalingrad is remembered as a turning point in World War II, but the story of the German POWs is often overshadowed by the massive casualties on both sides. These men, once part of Hitler's unstoppable army, were taken prisoner by the Soviet forces and reduced to nameless victims of a brutal conflict, a fate that only a few could survive. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most horrifying tales. And as we reflect on the past, we must never forget the lessons learned from these brutal experiences. War is never just about battle strategy or politics. It's about the lives that are forever altered, for better or worse. If you want more stories like this, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment below. Until next time, keep questioning history.